Good morning, everybody. And yes, I was involved in the World Trade Center program for quite a few years, so it's really good to have this little bit of connection still. So I'm going to talk about resilience, both in terms of how to understand it, think about it, and then how to try to kind of operationalize it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ways to define it. Also talk about the idea of post-traumatic growth, a related idea, and then talk about so-called resilience factors, ways to kind of identify and build our own resilience. So it's part theoretical or part academic and part practical, I hope. So we'll define resilience, post-traumatic growth, and then resilience factors. Conflicts of interest. A bunch of us, including Dr. Charney, are on a patent that involves some of this material through something called the Wellness Hub that we developed here for Mount Sinai employees. Okay, so actually going to start with just to kind of get all of your inputs. What word or phrase comes to your mind when you think of resilience? And in order to hear from you all, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and put up a poll everywhere. So, let's see. Yeah, so what word or phrase comes to your mind when you think of resilience? Hopefully you can see this. If you send a text to Craig Katz 346, along with 22333 and the word or phrase that comes to your mind, or you do this little QRS code here, we'll see what pops up if so take a moment and do that. And I think I have this set up correctly. And the reason I do this is because, well, one, because it's very interesting to hear from you all, of course, despite the limitations of Zoom. But second, I think we talk about resilience a lot. You hear about resilience a lot, I think, in popular discourse, but it's kind of good to kind of hone in on what we all think about it. So here we got some responses coming in. Looks like strength is in the lead. As you may know, the larger the word, the more responses it reflects. So yeah, so looks like strength is definitely the strongest response. But some of the words that have come in, like adversity, definitely are part of the. I mean, all your responses are in some sense or another are tied in with resilience. But as you know, tenacity, perseverance, bounce, which I will get back to as well, overcoming and adversity. You'll see all these terms come up. So you're way ahead of me. Maybe you could be giving this talk. So thank you for participating. I will now reshare my slides. Oops. Okay. So yeah. So I mean, as I said, a lot of the words that you all suggested definitely are aspects of resilience. In one way or the other, I would say for sure. Just to think a little bit about resilience, I like to use images of trees for this. Is resilience like this, which is sort of kind of bending in the wind, but really not really changing that much, just bending a little bit. And then is resilience sort of bouncing back to the way one was, so untouched, basically. Or is it bouncing back better than ever? Suddenly you're a beautiful tropical palm tree. So, I mean, those are just some images to be thinking about from a basic dictionary perspective. And this definitely captures some of the responses that you all gave, but the power or ability to return to the original form, position, et cetera, after being bent, compressed, et cetera, right? So this is a very kind of physical definition, right? But here you have the kind of idea of returning to your original form after basically being deformed by something. And then you have a whole bunch of thinkers, scholars, researchers that talk a whole lot about resilience. So I'm going to run through a whole bunch of different ideas about resilience. So this is from George Bonanno, who's actually over at Columbia. And his definition basically says that it's sort of that initial one I showed you with the tree sort of bending in the wind, but that's about it. Because if you you follow his definition here, whoops, the key thing, if you can see my cursor, is to maintain relative stable, healthy levels of psychological and physical functioning, right? So his idea of resilience is basically stability, barely changing that much. Other definitions from the American Psychological Association is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity and or any other sources of stress. And here you get the bouncing back idea that I think some of you mentioned in your responses. This is from our own Dr. Yehuda in our own department, an international trauma expert. She has a slightly more, I'd say, thoughtful or in-depth idea that is basically sort of a re-putting together of the self that includes like effortfulness on our part to kind of move forward with an insight and some sort of sense of positivity, taking the lessons we've learned, etc., from an adverse experience. So it's sort of like the old, I don't know if they still have this commercial, the old, I think, Timex watch commercial, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. Now, Dr. Maston talks about resilience as a capacity, right, to adapt. So it's a capacity, whereas let's say Dr. Yehuda's is one. It's an active definition. Resilience is something you do rather than something you have. And here's another: resilience as a process, something that you do, right? And I think this is an interesting definition because when we talk about resilience, one I think criticism that people have when we talk about resilience at the individual level is they say it puts too much responsibility on the individual and not enough on the system, particularly when we talk about the resilience of us here in a hospital or hospital system or healthcare system. That you're asking too much of the individual. But I would keep this definition in mind because it says harness resources, and it doesn't necessarily mean just internal resources. It can also, of course, mean things around you that one's community, employer offer. Okay, so what does all this come down to? Well, I think definitely agree. It's about weathering adversity, as some of you mentioned in the poll everywhere. But is it a trait? Are you resilient, or is it a process, something that you do, or resilience something that you aim for, an outcome? And it may depend on the challenge actually, and it may vary in different contexts and at different times in one's life. So something that enables one to be resilient at one point in one's life may not work in another part, or another way to put it is in some circumstances, resilience may work and not in other circumstances. And I'll try to give some examples along the way. So resilience actually may be fairly fluid depending upon what you're talking about, who you're talking about, and where you're talking about. And so let me just give so anyway, I'll leave it at that. So here's a putting it all together. Here is a suggested definition of resilience. And again, I mean, you don't one doesn't have to adhere strictly to any one definition, because you all kind of get the idea, but the ability to recover, grow, and adapt following adversity or challenge of any kind. And this is mostly from John DePiero, who you may know is one of the directors of our Center for Stress, Resilience, and Personal Growth, and is a co-author on Dr. Charney's most recent book on resilience. So the ability to recover, grow, and adapt following adversity. And I also added, or challenge of any kind, which is from the U.S. National Institutes of Health. So, bouncing back from some sort of stress, and not just bouncing back, but maybe growing, right? And that's another idea. So that brings me back to the tree images. And this is an idea I got from a conference a long time ago, which is the idea of resilience. In this image is a tree that grew up along the seashore, so in much harsher climate, with buffeted by winds, salt, extreme temperatures, and moisture. And you can see this tree doesn't grow like that nice, straight, perfect, symmetrical tree that I showed you earlier, nor like a palm tree. Got lots of twists and curves to it, but it's got a story to tell. And so I think this is an interesting definition of resilience, right? So, not a perfect tree, in terms of symmetry, but got a lot of depth and wisdom to it. And that's a way that I like to think about resilience and to picture resilience. There's also, I started to allude to this, but there is the idea of community resilience, right? The ability of a community to withstand and recover from adversity, and maybe, as John's definition suggests, grow as well. And that's something you certainly can think about in the context of the pandemic. I would say at our medical center or system community, certainly the system, the hospitals withstood a lot of adversity. So, and I think community resilience is a really interesting idea on top of an individual. And the ability of a community to be resilient has a lot to do with a number of factors, including the well-being of the community before, like the social and economic well-being, the physical and psychological health of the population itself, the level of social connectedness in the community that existed before, how much organizations are involved in planning and responding to the trauma, and then good risk communication, which is always a part of resilience and recovery from any kind of large scale trauma. And by the way, as you all know, I can't see most of you because the slides are up. If you have a comment or a question, feel free to just speak up. So these are the elements, I think, of community resilience. And I think it's interesting. I often talk about them in respect to 9/11, actually, and you can almost compare it, I think, to the COVID-19 pandemic, because my own feeling is that 9/11, at least here in New York, struck a community that was doing pretty well on the whole in terms of the economics. I think the city as a whole, economically and socially, was doing well. Of course, that varied with what borough and neighborhood one lived in. And so I think, although, as you all well know, 9/11 had a devastating effect on many people and still a lasting effect, I think it would have been a lot worse if New York were in worse shape at the time. And actually, to give it a different comparison, I think the COVID-19 pandemic hit at a time when there's a lot more political divisiveness and racial tensions, etc. And that's why I think that the pandemic has a bigger effect. And I've been asked to talk a lot and consult in Israel following the October 7th attacks, and they're very interested in the comparison between October 7th and 9/11. And I think one of the biggest differences is that Israel was dealing with a lot of political upheaval before the October 7th attacks regarding very, very conservative government and attempts to overhaul the judiciary. And there were a lot of ongoing protests and unrest. So I feel that that's another example where at the community level, I think a place like Israel was not as well positioned to deal with October 7th as I think New York City was to deal with 9/11. My opinion, can't prove it. But this is an example of that I like a lot about community level resilience. And this is from Hurricane Sandy. These researchers, what they did is they went and they talked to community members out in the Rockaways about their experience of the hurricane, the superstorm, and the recovery, and what the recovery was like for them, how involved they felt, how much they felt heard in terms of influencing or even contributing to their community's recovery. And what these researchers came up with was the idea of resilience reserve, which was, basically kind of how much fuel did they have in the tank when Hurricane Sandy hit. And the Far Rockaways, much of them are pretty lower income, a lot of public housing in that area, and dealing with a lot of different, sort of socioeconomic challenges before Hurricane Sandy hit. And as a consequence, the researchers talked about how they just didn't have as much resilience because, in a sense, they had spent it down. And I think they even asked the question, was the community too resilient to begin with? Meaning, in other words, were they kind of too good at thriving before Hurricane Sandy, and being more self-reliant and not getting as much external help from whatever the city, the state, the federal government, and as a consequence, were sort of drained by the time Hurricane Sandy came along. And I think it's a really interesting idea, but I also think one can think about this on an individual level. Where is one's individual resilience reserve? This is from studies that Adriana Feder here at Sinai and a team did, looking at paths to recovery and of responders. And excuse me, sorry. And on this is across different visits through the World Trade Center health monitoring program, and the y-axis, the PCL score, which is the PTSD symptom checklist. And what was found was there were 4 different trajectories, and the top graph is for police, and the bottom were non-traditional World Trade Center responders, like volunteers, for example, or iron workers, etc. And so but they both basically show the same thing. So you can look at either one of these graphs, but let's look at the top one. This line here, not budging, is the Bonanno version of resilience. You to stay the same across time. And then you have another potential view of resilience. This curve here, if you see my cursor, right, you have a spike in your PTSD symptoms that look, at least on paper, like PTSD here, and then you come down over time. Although, visits 2, 3, it's spread out over time. But is this resilience sort of bouncing back as your PTSD symptoms diminish? These others, of course, we would not think of as resilient. This is somebody who had a very high PTSD score and it never went down at the top. And this is someone who actually looked better at visit 1, but over time looked worse for whatever reason. But the key thing that I show for this talk is this curve. Is this resilience or is this resilience? Right? That's just different ideas about resilience. The flip side of resilience is the risk factors. Who is more likely to do poorly in the face of trauma and adversity? And there are some very well-known risk factors that contribute to the likelihood of being on one of those, not good curves that I just showed you. And so those factors include the dose of trauma, which, how does one measure a dose of trauma? Well, it's not quite like measuring like a dose of radiation exposure, but it can involve personal injury, grieving, having lost family or coworkers, and in an event, economic impact. Those are all things that go into dose of trauma. And of course, the more exposed one is, the more likely that one is to suffer psychiatrically down the road. That being said, there are lots of other factors that have to do with who you were before, what your life was like before, prior exposure to trauma or disaster, and really more not just the prior exposure, but how well you dealt with it. And then prior psychiatric history. Again, it's not just having had any kind of mental health problems before, but also how well they were identified and treated. And then the next one is problems in living prior to the disaster. And this is sort of like the Hurricane Sandy study that I mentioned to you, which is the people whose lives were not going well before, right? If you throw a disaster into the mix, whether it's 9/11 or the pandemic or war, etc., right? It's just makes sense. They're going to be even more vulnerable and do even worse than if things were better before. The presence of social support, well, I'll talk about that as a protective factor, but a lack of social support is a risk factor. Secondary stresses would be things like, for example, having to relocate after a trauma, like during, after, let's say, a hurricane. If you are displaced from where you live, for like hundreds of miles, and therefore can no longer commute to your job, that's a secondary stress. Or having to live in a FEMA trailer for a year, even if it's in the same community, that's a stress, right? So, and then there's some things we consider sort of non-modifiable. Gender, we think that female gender is a risk factor, although some debate whether that's really a biological fact or just a more of a sociological one, where women are more likely to acknowledge their distress and come forward for help. And being an ethnic minority, an underrepresented minority, is definitely a risk factor, right? And that we saw and we see definitely in the literature during the pandemic and during the Black Lives Matter movement. You definitely saw studies come out about, let's say, for example, African Americans being at higher risk for mental health problems during the pandemic. So that's resilience. So a little bit about post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth, as the name suggests, is positive psychological change in the face of trauma or a really big challenge. But the key thing, I think, is what I underlined here, which is the word struggle, and that's what this green oval is supposed to represent, right? So a trauma hits, and then one struggles with it, and the question is, where does that struggle take you? The green line is post-traumatic growth. The other lines may be, you come back to your baseline, or your worse, depending upon which way you go, but how the struggle goes. But the idea is one can't grow from a trauma, if one is going to grow from a trauma, unless there's a struggle. There has to be some distress, and that growth can come. People who study this suggest that post-traumatic growth can happen in 5 different areas: a sense of personal strength, how one feels connected to others, spiritual or existential changes, feeling a greater connection to not just people, but the world at large, the universe, if you want to put it in that way, maybe a higher power, appreciating life. That's probably the one we're most familiar with, the idea, the basic idea of being glad to be alive and seeing the positives in life. And that's the last one, which is seeing new possibilities, avenues for growth or enjoyment or fulfillment that you did not see before or felt equipped to pursue before. That can happen depending upon how well that struggle goes. And this is a related idea. So, and I think this is a really important idea, right? Having, let's say, post-traumatic stress disorder from a trauma is not in any way inconsistent with the possibility of growth. In fact, if you go with the idea that you need to have the struggle, having PTSD symptoms enables you to grow. Now, I mean, it would be nice if one wants to grow or needs to grow to do so without going through a trauma. However, if you're going to go through a trauma, you might as well grow, right? And so you'll see here that lower level of PTSD symptoms, you don't grow as much. But then you start heading into these numbers like 30, 40, right, which on the post-traumatic checklist for the DSM-5, when you get up to around 35, that's sort of around the cutoff for likely PTSD. So you can see as you get into the diagnostic area for PTSD, there's a peak in the post-traumatic growth in this particular study. And then as the numbers get high, you start going down again, right? So the idea is there is probably for lack of a better word, a sweet spot in terms of PTSD symptoms that enable one to grow. If the PTSD is too mild, which is okay. I mean, I'm sure anyone with PTSD would prefer to have mild PTSD, if at all. But if it's mild, you're less likely to grow, and if it's too severe, you're less likely to grow. So looking for sort of the moderation. So that is some information about defining, thinking about resilience, community resilience, and a related idea of post-traumatic growth. And actually, it's just one thing I would add about post-traumatic growth. It turns out that the more resilient one is, the less likely you actually are to grow. They actually kind of indirectly, inversely related, I'm sorry, to one another. If you're resilient, then to begin with, if you have the idea of resilience as a capacity, then you're less likely to grow. But if you have lower resilience and then are actually able to grow, then you develop more resilience, right? Anyway, okay, so this is now to get into the so-called resilience factors. So this is based off of Dr. Charney's and the late Steve Southwick's research over the years. Particularly, they did a lot of work originally with special forces from the military, did a lot of work with former prisoners of war, particularly from Vietnam. And so, well, I'm sorry, one moment. Sorry. About that. So yeah, so in their research over the years, they've come up with these 10 different resilience factors, which are both their combination of behaviors, of sort of external circumstances, of traits, outlooks about that we have that enable us to be resilient. And so there are 10 of them, and I'm just going to talk about a number of them in turn. So realistic optimism, right? That's the first one up there, realistic optimism. So realistic optimism is basically the idea, not blind optimism, but real optimism that sort of recognizes the negative, but chooses to focus on the positive. Or, in a sense, somebody that, only pays attention to relevant negative information rather than getting bogged down in it. And then try to focus on, paths forward, right? It's sort of like focusing on lowest hanging fruit, if you like that metaphor. So kind of being solution oriented. And this table, this figure kind of helps distinguish a little bit realistic optimism from what would certainly be its opposite, which is pessimism, right? So you could see, usually I like to have a discussion around this, but what is the difference between the two in the choice of wording? Someone who's engaged in pessimism tends to kind of be sort of black and white. So they tend to talk in absolutes, always, never. Whereas someone who engages in realistic optimism kind of talks more in the gray area, the moderated area, sometimes lately. So the difference would be, I'm going to feel bad forever, versus down here, I will feel bad for some time, right? Or this will ruin everything. That's the pessimistic view. But the realistic optimist would say, this, work is hard for now, but everything else seems okay, right? It's not going to ruin everything, right? Or things seem ruined for now, but it's not going to be forever, right? Those are the kind of the ideas. So the pessimism tends to be kind of caught up in rather extreme thinking. So and so that's an outlook, right? I mean, one can try to work on being more optimistic. And actually, it's interesting. I heard an interview last night on CNN. No, it was CNBC, I think. The interviewer was talking about. Anyway, he was talking about the precise idea of actually changing his worldview a bit after someone told him, that was a senator that spoke to him and told him that his job was to be a optimist, and the senator's job was, that is, and it got this then congressional staffer, now he's a TV anchor, to be thinking about how negative he was, and so he actually feels he did change his outlook. So I don't think, and we could talk about this, that we are, I don't think it's good to label any of us optimists or pessimists necessarily, or if we do, it is potentially modifiable. Not easy. Another combination of factors is active coping and facing fear. So these are some quotes about it from some very famous people, the writer James Baldwin and the jazz musician Duke Ellington, right? So this is, I think these are really kind of telling quotes, right? And they relate to the idea, when someone is in a position, and I often find myself talking with patients like this about this, where they're dealing with a situation and they say it's never going to change, whatever the situation, maybe a job situation, maybe a marital situation, or whatever, and they say it's never going to change. And the position I take with them, well, it's better, it's more likely to change if you do something than if you don't. If you don't, sounds like it's not going to change. If you do something, it's a better than zero chance that it might change. And that is, a different version, a less eloquent version of what these two gentlemen, particularly Mr. Baldwin, is talking about. The lower side too, a lower quote from Dr. Duke Ellington, is also talking about the idea of worrying about the things that you have some control over, not the things that you don't. And this is, for me, one of the most useful graphs and concepts in all of psychology, just in basic human psychology. And that curve, you might be familiar with, I don't have it labeled, but it's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And it's many, many decades old. So the x-axis is anxiety. The y-axis is function. And the basic idea here, and this gets at the idea of facing fear, which is that, in fact, anxiety is again getting to that idea of fuel in the tank. Anxiety energizes us, motivates us to face the things that might be frightening us, and that we do need to change, or in some form respond to. And so, at some point, you get to sort of a point of maximal functioning when you have a certain level of anxiety. And this is sort of like that graph. This is the PTSD and growth, post-traumatic growth I showed you. Actually, it's sort of analogous. So we need some anxiety to function optimally, especially for things, if you think about it, like tests, in school, or for professional certifications, like who likes tests? So you need some level of anxiety to actually motivate you to study, etc. But if you get too anxious, you start to lose that function. And really, I actually think, if I could make this the Yerkes-Dodson-Katz curve, I would have the right end of this curve go below zero, down below, and get into, not just baseline functioning, but worse functioning, dysfunction. And a lot of these ideas about facing fear come from the land of cognitive behavioral therapy, in terms of, if one is in a fearful situation, what is one's impulse? What does one do? And well, let me see if I have a better, yeah, okay. So the idea here, the basic idea in cognitive behavioral therapy is that this red box, thoughts, is where we can modify, in our behaviors we can modify. So in other words, how one's reflexive reactions, one's thoughts in response to a traumatic event, a scary event, is obviously going to shape how one interprets and responds to it. And of course, from behavioral psychology, how we act also, of course, affects not just how we get through a situation, but also how we feel. So these are things to focus on. So in other words, let's say, just to use a very basic 9/11 example, 9/11 happens. Someone who worked down near Lower Manhattan says, I can never come back to New York City, right? Let's say they live, I don't know, let's say in Westchester. I can never work again in New York City, right? That's a very extreme thought. And it may be derived from another premise, right? Which is life is not fair, right? And so their underlying thought, something that they carried along with them even before 9/11, was life is not fair. And even more extreme might have been life is never fair, right? And so 9/11 just plugs right into that, because of course 9/11 wasn't fair. But does that mean life is never fair, or that life blanketly is not fair? Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Um, if anything, if you think about our World Trade Center program, that's an example of the fairness of life, the resources that and the goodwill that were poured into helping people after 9/11. But if they stuck through that, life isn't fair, um, that could well lead to depression, right? Because it's a rather very negative view of the event. And so what we want to do is help them to loosen that thinking up. And those are what we, in our lingo, we call cognitions, or right. But basically, we all walk around, every one of us, with a certain sort of premises, beliefs about ourselves, the people around us, the world, the environment, that are sort of our kind of the lenses through which we see all those different things. And if they are overly negative, right, such as this whole litany of negative things on the left, they're going to likely get us in trouble. We want to shift negative things. If you take this top one, I don't deserve love. Some people feel that way. We want that to become I deserve love, or I can have love, right? So we want to shift over to the positive. Of course, we don't want extreme positive, overly, blindly positive things. We want to shift to positive cognitions, and that's what enables us to face fear. So these are things that Dr. Charney writes about, approaches to facing fear, and that we crystallized from his book on this, the chapter in his book on this. So the key thing about facing fear, I think, is actually the first one. We always talk about avoiding. If something is troubling you or scaring you, and you avoid it, it doesn't get better. And in fact, the problem itself may get worse. Whatever the problem is, it could be a health problem, it could be a financial problem, an interpersonal problem. It's certainly not going to get better, and it may get worse. And minimally, when you avoid things that scare you, in your mind, they get bigger. They have more power. And even if the thing itself hasn't changed, your perception of it will. And so, right, because the imagination runs wild, it also tends to reflect on how you see yourself, that I can't face up to it. And so we talk about avoiding, I think is sort of a favorite phrase of ours. But also thinking about fear as a guide or opportunity, right? This gets back to that curve, anxiety pointing us in the direction of things we need to do, even if we don't want to. And then there are other ways to face fear. I won't go through all these, but basically, with support, people nudging you to kind of jump into the pool, so to speak. Okay, another resilience factor, physical fitness. And this is, I guess, probably the most obvious of them, and in that sense, maybe the hardest of them. But we well know that physical exercise is good for us in general. And when the chips are down and you're in a really stressful situation, it's as important as ever. Even though when people are in like disastrous situations, when they're recovering, it can seem kind of silly to say, well, you should do some physical exercise. But it is enormously important. If one didn't have a physical exercise regimen before trauma, it's kind of hard to start it then, unfortunately. But doing something is important. And even pattern ways of breathing. And Dick Brown, a psychiatrist from Columbia, goes around to different disasters around the world and teaches people how to do all sorts of different breathing in sort of meditative yogic ways to help them. And it's not physical exercise per se, but it does help to modulate the mind. And of course, healthy eating and sleeping habits. The fourth one, I think, is one that I like a lot. I read a quote from some general that talked about this, but even one of our medical students, like a number of years ago, we were doing an exercise on wellness, just like the word cloud we did earlier. And we were asking people, how does one be well, and how do you attain wellness? And one student said, you make your bed. It's a small thing, but if you start your day with that sense of order, it sets the tone for the day, even if the day winds up to be chaotic and disorderly. And then no matter what happens during the day, when you hopefully are able to come home at the end of the day, you come home to a made bed. So it just sets the right tone, and it's something to come back to. And the other thing about wellness is knowing when you're in distress and allowing yourself to feel distress. And many of us have a hard time with that. Feeling that we're not, especially I think in healthcare. And I think for those of you who are on the call, I think doctors are the worst at this, which is, knowing when you are distressed and feeling like you're allowed to be distressed and doing something about it, as opposed to taking care of everybody else's distress. And this is a good way to monitor one's stress. It's called the stress continuum model, but the basic idea, and I actually, we have little badges made up, and you can't see me right now, but I have it on my, as one of, right behind my race card on my ID badge, monitoring oneself for where you are on this scale at any given time or any given day or week, right? Then the exact details, the distinction between green, yellow, orange, and red are not so important. The overall continuum here is important, right? Which is, going from feeling good and ready, the green, you're like at the green light, you're ready to go, to developing mild distress, a little bit of anxiety, maybe a little distractibility, to worsening sleep problems, to more disengagement, to exhaustion, to the red, more critical when one is in a place of outright burnout or major depression or PTSD, knowing that about oneself. And we actually, this is the military uses this, and they actually use it in what they call a battle buddy method or system, which is they pair up soldiers to look after each other and to use this continuum to check in. Where are you today, or where are you now? And so it's not just for oneself theoretically, but checking in on one's colleagues, coworkers. And we piloted this during the peak of the pandemic on one of the nursing units with, I think mixed uptake, I would say, for different reasons. But it's actually, I think it's, not complicated, pretty straightforward. And the basic idea is to check in with oneself, basically to take one's mental pulse and maybe that of a coworker. And there are basic things one can do if one is in the yellow or maybe even orange in the course of your workday. And it's something like box breathing, which maybe you've heard of, which is just this idea of inhaling. Again, it's a breathing technique, but so many of us, and I do this quite a bit, when you spend the day sort of half kind of constricted and not breathing deeply and sort of tight chested. And it creates tension and it reflects tension. And so breathing more deeply can literally release the physical tension, and with it, and maybe this sounds corny to you, some of the mental tension as well. So box breathing is 4 seconds of breathing in, 4 seconds of holding it, 4 seconds of breathing out, and then 4 seconds of just pausing, sort of, a resting state. And it's called box breathing because you're kind of drawing a box, 4 different sides as you go. And it's something, obviously, if you do it exactly by the second, it's 16 seconds. Often it takes a few rounds of this to maybe get something more substantial out of it. But it is something that's obviously pretty easy to do if one thinks to do it, if one is aware that one is getting too stressed in the course of the day, to do something like this, to try to, take some tension out of your body and your mind. Also on physical fitness, this is, from the U.S. Preventative Task Force. This is how much activity is recommended in the course of the week. So 150 minutes of more aerobic cardiovascular activity, and then 2 days a week somehow of muscle strengthening activity. So, the moderate intensive aerobic activity, my rough understanding, you got to get your heart going. And another way to think about it is, when it starts to become hard to have a conversation with somebody else. Right. And so these are, by the way, are things, of course, one can do not just in the face of a trauma, but in general. And I think it's always important if you have this as part of your regimen, then if you are, if you are hit by something traumatic, then you're going to be better positioned to handle it better. And maybe also have in your toolkit the idea of using physical activity to help you modulate your response to the trauma. All right, another couple of, and I've condensed some of the resilience factors so won't talk about them individually, but we've put them together. And so social support and role models, right? So here's an interesting example. This is from Dr. Charney's work with prisoners of war from Vietnam, and people like, former Senator, the late John McCain. So this is an example of the human need for connection, particularly when the chips are down. And these are from prisoners of war who were in Vietnam and sort of, basically individual, solitary confinement, and they would be taken out one by one and tortured and then brought back to their cell. And, they were left to not only, nurse their physical wounds, but their mental wounds on their own. And what they were able to do is create something called a tap code, where they would tap on the wall. And I guess you could kind of think of it like Morse code, but they figured out an alphabet between them, the full English alphabet, so that they could communicate with one another and support one another during, after torture, or in general during, prolonged months and years of captivity. And so it, enabled them to provide social support to one another. And so it's a really, incredibly powerful thing. And if we had more time, I don't think I have it. Yeah, I would show you literally how they did the tapping, but they just had anyway, it was a very simple but ingenious thing that they did. So, I guess, what is our sort of real life tap code? Well, these are the recommendations from Dr. Charney's book about social support. So one is knowing who you can turn to support, which, we call it sort of take an inventory of the supports in your life. Two is to invest effort in seeking out support. And this is really important. I think it's especially important, again, in sort of healthcare professionals who, again, tend to want to take care of other people more than themselves. But sometimes often you need to let people know that you need support. Or many of us, I think, feel like they need to be given permission to ask about how a colleague or a friend or a family member is doing. But putting in effort, seeking support, don't assume that people know what you're going through, or that they can, see it on your face, or, in a sense, read your mind. Giving support is really good. It feels good. I think that's something that probably comes, more easily to most anybody on this call. And building your social network, easier said than done. And if we had more time, we have different ideas about how to do all of these things, which may all sort of sound like kind of common sense, or may sound like easier said than done, but there actually are ways to do all these things, so that for the people in one's life, they know that you're there for them, and you know who's there for you when life throws the inevitable curveballs that it does. And this is also the concept of role models, sort of a particular kind of social support. Having a role model that you consider resilient, somebody that you feel has really bounced back from adversity well, is something that you can use to build your own resilience. And this graph on the right, just without going into the details, basically shows that having positive, resilient role models can buffer against depression in the face of trauma. And so it's kind of having these role models, trying to think through what skills, what enables them to be resilient, trying out those skills for oneself, practicing them, and maybe even seeking support from that role model. I think as an example that I've heard in some workshops that we do these resilience workshops around the medical center. People talked about David Rich during the pandemic, the president of the Mount Sinai Hospital, and talk about him as a resilient role model, for example. I actually just heard something really interesting doing a resilience workshop with some Israeli psychologists a few weeks ago. They talked about how the elderly, someone who's, let's say, beginning to develop some dementia, can think of them earlier, their younger self, as a resilient role model, to sort of look back on their younger self and back at the strengths that one has to get to that point in life, and derive some strengths from that, which I thought was a really kind of cool idea. All right, next set of resilience factors is faith and meaning and spirituality. And I'll finish in a couple of minutes and take any comments or questions. This is from Viktor Frankl, who you might know of. He was a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust. And he, borrowing a little bit, I think, from the philosopher Nietzsche, talked about the idea that if you have a purpose, you can bear, at least he said, almost anything, right? If you have a why to live, you can bear with any how you have to live. And he also talked about the idea that no matter how rough circumstances are, if you have meaning and purpose, you can get through. But that's the lack of meaning, the lack of purpose is really what makes life unbearable, not one's necessarily physical circumstances. Now, many people feel that that's overly idealistic. How does that really help someone that lives in a violence-ridden neighborhood? Or again, his observation were from the Holocaust, those who kept in mind their loved ones, or developed some daily routine or some little purpose, like sharing some of their bread with some of their fellow detainees, that gave them some purpose. That's the basic idea, to find meaning. But to spirituality, this sense, I don't think I have a slide with the definition, but spirituality, no, I don't. The idea of connecting to something larger than oneself, not necessarily having to be in a religious tradition and any formal spirituality, but I could certainly be in that too. But a sense of connection to something bigger than oneself, even bigger within oneself than what's at the surface, can be enormously powerful. I've been amazed by people I've met, let's say, in post-Civil War Liberia, where they went through horrible things, and you talk to some of them, and like, what enabled you to get through? And they talk about God. If one has a God, one believes in God. A lot of them talk about that. I'm amazed by that. See the same thing amongst survivors of abuse and persecution that come up from Central America and seek asylum here in the States. Spirituality. Of course, one can't just snap one finger and become spiritual. And I actually think I've sort of written about this a little bit. I think, modern medicine has become sort of a little anti-spiritual, placing less belief in, less faith in faith, and more belief in just evidence. You have to be able to see it with your eyes, rather than belief. I think we've probably swung a little too far that way. But anyway, these are different ways to maintain some kind of nurture, find some kind of spirituality in one's day-to-day life, praying, meditating, reading religious texts, physical activity that has a spiritual bent to it, like yoga, etc. So and then of course participating in religious worship, if that is one's thing. Let's see, what do I have next? Okay, and then on the meaning side, going back to Viktor Frankl, here's some interesting ways to think about meaning in one's life. Regularly search for meaning in the experiences of my daily life. Look for it. Some people do this by what they call a gratitude practice, and think about what one has to be grateful for in the course of one day. The second one I like a lot. I think it's maybe a little bit easier to grasp what it means. But when you are faced with a challenge, think a little bit about what is life asking of me. Think about that and see if one can rise to the occasion. All right. Okay, last section. I think moral compass. I guess I'll just say very quickly, attending to one sense of what is right and what is wrong, and using it as a guide um, is an enormous way to get through very tough circumstances. And this came up a lot in the course of the pandemic in terms of the potential need, the need to separate families from their dying loved ones, or potentially to ration supplies, and that cuts against our moral fibers. And how one deals with that will very much shape one's ability to bounce back. Um, Too many slides. Okay, my last slide. So resilience again is about weathering adversity and possibly growing from it. There's the idea of having a resilience reserve. Resilience reflects a mix of psychological and probably biological factors, also circumstances, and there are a number of different ways one can act and think to cultivate or promote one's resilience. But I also want to just say one need not be resilient in all ways. There are whatever 10 resilience factors according to Dr. Charney. I collapsed them a little bit for the purposes of this talk. But we all have different strengths within us. So one may not be spiritual, but one may be more likely to be a realistic optimist, etc. On the other hand, when we do workshops around this, we talk about having a resilience plan and thinking about which areas of resilience make the most sense to you and that you want to work on. And so that's what I would leave you with. Was anything that you take away from this talk that maybe that you would like to build on in terms of the resilience in your life?